Going to start off with asking the question, do you need a retention policy? Now, it's a general, I know it seems obvious to ask because we're a DMS, we're storing your documents. Do you really need to have a policy into place? Now, there's no exact answer to this, but you can consider some of the following questions. First of all, does the document contain any personal identifying data or PID? If your documents do contain PID, then best practices recommend holding documents only for as long as absolutely necessary if it contains that PID. And the reason is because you don't want to have data breaches, you don't want information being shared when it's not not meant to be, you don't want documents accessed past that point in case it has that PID. It's always a point of vulnerability for an organization, and best practices recommends getting rid of that as soon as you can. The second question is there a regulatory obligation to maintain the documents? Now, every industry has their own standards as defined by, could be governmental regulations, could be professional organization standards. For instance, if you have a contract with a labor union, then that's a good example of where they may have standards that are more enforceable by contract as opposed to enforceable by regulatory bodies. But I'd still put it under that regulatory obligation category. And then, of course, there's industry best practices. If people say, well, this is what we typically do in this industry, then when you're dealing with others in that same sector, it may make sense to follow those same standards. Consider a legal department, for example, if they have a practice of holding documents for instance, 5 years after a case is closed, then that becomes a standard that's probably used within that industry, and that would be the expectation moving forward. So you should always respect those obligations that are coming through and make sure that whatever policy you're putting into place matches and follows those regulations, both because there's a legal aspect to that. You want to make sure that you're protected, but you also want to make sure that you're not going outside of the norm. Does the document serve an organizational need or process? If you're not using the document, do you need to keep the document? Now, there's document hoarding is a very real thing when it comes to digital information, because digital paper or scanned documents or purely electronic documents can be stored cheaply, but they can contribute to that sort of stockpiling, that hoarding, that gathering of all the documents. And again, it's recommended that if the document no longer serves a useful purpose, it should be disposed of at the earliest convenience. So while you might need that document in 10 years' time, is it worth storing that document for the 10-year period to get to that point if it's not something that couldn't obviously be recreated somewhere else? So for example, some people keep these documents for research, but if you don't truly need to be doing that operationally, it may not serve a benefit. So then let's talk about deleting, which is the key part of a retention policy. When we no longer want to retain the document, we're going to be deleting it off the system. So we want to be very clear on this. FileHold will never delete your documents without a user action or a policy instructing when to delete. So we're going to keep your documents or records in perpetuity until you ask us to get rid of it. And we're going to say that one more time. FileHold will never delete your documents unless you ask us to. So your documents are secure in the system. Anything we're talking about here for retention policies, keep this in mind. We are talking about putting a policy into place that you're choosing to do. It's nothing that we're going to force you to do. This is entirely optional. Retention policies are enforced by events. Now, if you've not seen events, we're going to be looking at that in a moment. So we want to talk about how we can use that event in order to enforce the policy. Events are template-based processes applied to a schema to delete, archive, preserve, or remind. So it depends on how you configure them as to how they're going to be enacted against the documents. Only one deletion policy per schema. So we can't have multiple retention policies on a document. We need to have one. If you're in a situation where you need to distinguish one set of retention policies from another, that means what you need is a different schema. So you want to introduce a secondary schema into there because that's where you're going to get more of your value out of it. So only one deletion policy per schema. Deletions are triggered by metadata. So when we're doing any of these events, we're going to trigger that event using the metadata fields. We have administrative metadata, such as when the document was added to FileHold or the date last modified. These are typically things that are going to be outside of your control operationally. You can influence them, but you can't actually define the dates. You couldn't go into FileHold and say, I added this date on September 1st. No, the document was added on September 2nd. That's when it came into the system, and you can't actually change that. Descriptive metadata is what we normally associate with metadata, that information tags you want to put against it. That's where you're putting your information on the document that helps to describe and define it. That's where you could put a date added into the system on September 1, and you can control that date because it's under your control. So how to set up a retention policy. So we have a few questions that you want to ask internally. The first question is, we need to identify your policy needs for the document. Are there regulatory obligations or organizational policies that need to be, sorry, I got a typo there, that need to be reflected in retention? Do you need a record of destruction for documents? Again, something that's important to consider before you move down the retention path. We're not going to be covering records of destruction in full today. I do want to say there's a mode called convert to offline documents. I just published a blog on this on our website, so I would encourage people to go to www.filehold.com and take a look at our blog posts onto there, and you'll see my one on records of destruction. So if that's something you need, there's a good resource there to check out. Second step is to identify document or record types that need the policy. Are these unique or a shared schema? If it's a shared schema, you may need to break out that schema in order to have the policy apply to only some of the documents. Remember, these are global policies towards the schema, so we want to make sure that we're enforcing properly. Third step is to create an event template that matches the policy needs. You can use the appropriate metadata for the trigger, and of course, if you don't have that available, you can add a metadata field to create that trigger. Fourth step is to add the event template to the appropriate schema, adjust the metadata requirements if needed, and then 5, confirm the policy is active in the version properties. And we're going to take a look at that in a moment today. So we're going to take a look and see how that policy is actually being used. All right, and with that, we're going to just take a look at our use case, which today we're going to be talking about an invoice with a retention policy of end of fiscal year plus 6, which typically translates through to 7 years. So if you put a 7-year policy on an invoice, then that'll stay. And that's appropriate for Canadian and US audit laws. So that's why we're using that as a very simple example. We don't need a record of destruction, so this is going to be a pure deletion process. There's going to be no shared schema in this case. It's going to be a unique schema, only one being used for invoices. And the trigger that we're going to use for the metadata is going to be the invoice date. So an influenceable descriptive field of metadata that we can control for the documents. All right, let's hop in and take a look at my system. So we are looking right now at the web client, and because I'm a good user, I'm just going to do a quick refresh onto here. There we go, perfect. And I'm going to actually step away from the library view of the web client. We're going to go over to the administration panel. Now notice I'm logged in here as my sysadmin account. By the way, if you have an account named sysadmin, please change it because this is a terrible name for security's sake. I only do it here because I'm in a closed off environment. This is a test environment, not production. So I would never have that name in an actual environment. Okay, we're going to go over to our administration, full administration menu. And now we're going to scroll down. Let's just collapse some of our stuff here. In the first place, I'm going to have a quick stop at here, system configuration settings general, because we want to make sure that we can turn these policies on. Now, when you get FileHold, if you're coming out of the box and you're opening it up, you may be looking at saying, why can't I get my events running? And that's because you have event schedule settings and we need to turn them all on. And in this case, the one we really care about is enable delete events. But this is also where we can control the creation of convert to record events. So take a document, convert it to a record so no one else can make a change to it. Archive it, move it from the active library, move it down into the archive section. Enable user-defined events. Send a reminder through to the document owner or to administration that a document needs to be looked at. And the one we're going to be looking at today is enable delete events. Now, the reason these are grayed out in my system is because I already have policies that use all of these functions. So because I have events that are in use right now, I can't turn them off because I'm using that function. So if I was to go out and turn off all my events and make sure they're removed from my schema, I could then disable that into here. But we typically don't see people doing that. And as always, remember, there's a help icon up here. So if you want to see some more information about that, click there. It'll take you over to our knowledge base. You can take a deeper dive into that. Great. So once we know that we can do events, we now want to create some event templates for ourselves. Remember that a lot of what we're dealing with in FileHold is template-based working. So we create a template for a schema, we apply it to a document. We create a template for a metadata field, we apply it to a schema. We create a template for a control field, such as a document control number. We apply it to a document. Same thing with events. So we're going to come over here to our events, and you'll see a list of my existing events. And you can see I've got already a policy that's in place. It's very similar to what we want, but we're going to build something out custom for ourselves right now. So we're going to start off with going to add event, and now we're going to give this event a name for it. So we're going to call this webinar delete after. Try spelling that right, after 7 years. So we're just going to put a global 7-year policy on it. Under the description over here, again, you've got, so I'm going to say for webinar Wednesdays. And then we've got our type down here, which is going to allow me to what kind of event we're going to be doing. And we're going to be doing a deletion event because we're talking about retention policies. We're talking about getting rid of documents when they're no longer needed. I have 3 fields that I can choose from. That's administrative metadata, and then I can choose a custom metadata field or descriptive metadata to apply against the document. Our first field up here is a document created date, when the document was added into FileHold. That is not when the document was first made. So we're not concerned in this case about if the document came over from your desktop and it's been on your desktop for 11 years, and you're now bringing it into FileHold. To FileHold, it would be today's date. So it would have today's date as the stamp onto that as soon as you brought it in. So we want to be careful when we're using document created date. It's not the original creation date. If you did want to use that, that's more likely going to be a custom metadata field. Document last modified date, when it was last changed into the system. So if you have a document that's supposed to delete, for instance, let's say it was something like it was a contract, you want it to delete 2 years after it expires. We're going to use the date of expiration for that, but we're also going to say when it was last, the document was last modified. So if someone makes adjustments to the contract, it's going to reset that every 2 years and push it further down the road. So it's an opportunity for us to keep these retention policies live and active. And same thing with metadata last modified. If somebody goes in to change the metadata, you may want to use that as a policy. Your custom metadata field over here, on the other hand, is exactly what we want. So we're going to select this because the actual date that we want to use for these is going to be something I've already built. Now you can see I've got a lot of date-based metadata fields. So I don't expect most people to have this many, but it's what I have. And I've got an invoice date down here, which we identified earlier is going to be the trigger that we want for this. So our policy will go against the invoice date. We now need to choose our period. So we've got some different time increments over here, days, weeks, months, or years. In this case, we want years, and we want to make the period of this 7 years. So that is enough now to enact the policy. This means that 7 years after the document is added into the system, it will then be deleted from here as soon as it's done. Now I can do a notification on this, but I want to give a word of warning onto this. The notification can only go out to somebody who has guaranteed access to the document. There's only 2 groups that have guaranteed access to documents: system administrators and senior library administrators. So they're going to be the only eligible users. So even though I may have a rich list of different users, when if I was to ask this to send a notification and go into this, I'm only going to get my users who have that level. So I've only got senior library admins and my system administrators are the only groups. So we often don't see this notification being used unless it's to a system administrator who's monitoring the system, and that's kind of the goal for this. Now we have some other options when it comes to other categories. As for instance, if we use the user-defined field, we can send that message to a document owner. But in this case, we're not going to worry about that because we're keeping focused on this one deletion kind of event. So that's satisfactory now for us to save this. We're going to call save, and we've now made a policy. So we can see the policy when it was built, and we've got all our essential key details here. Perfect. We'll go back to our list. This is where often the so you can see our list over here. We haven't used it in any schema yet. So our next step now will be to apply this to a document type. So I could leave the screen if I wanted to, but let's just head down to our document schemas. And we're going to go to our AP invoices. And then we're going to go down to our event schedule. So we can see down here that there's no events on this. There's no convert to records, archive, delete, or user define, which we have never, 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 and none. So we've got some options there. Now, before I apply this, I want to step away for a second. We're going to go back over to the desktop application, and I'm going to do a quick refresh. So we're going to refresh all. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make sure that what I'm showing you is as accurate as possible. So I'm just doing a quick refresh in the system. Whenever I play with my system settings, I always like to come back and do a refresh. We're going to click over here onto our document, and we're going to take a look at its metadata and file properties. So here we go. Here's our document. It has its different metadata fields, including its invoice date, and we've got down here our version property, so our information about this document. Excellent. So we've seen this. That's what I want to double check. Now we're going to go back into the web client, and now we're going to apply this event template that we've made. So we're going to go under Edit, and then here's where we can apply these. Now notice our top 3, convert to record, archive, and delete, are a drop-down. The reason they're a drop-down menu is you can only have one of those policies. I can only delete a document once, I can only archive it once, I can only convert it to a record once. And so for clarity, we do only one of those per event. In the situation where you may have more than one policy being applied to a document, could be argued that you need a better policy, but we also appreciate that sometimes it's not multiple policies on a document, it's multiple policies on different documents, in which case then we'd recommend a different schema so that you can apply the proper document to the proper retention policy to the proper document. So we're going to go under here to delete, and we're going to take a look at all of our eligible policies. And so in this case, webinar delete after 7 years. So we're going to webinar delete after 7 years is now put onto this, and I can save that, and we're good. Now, the metadata field used by the selected event in the event schedule setup has to be read-only. So this is a requirement that FileHold has. A read-only date means that once it's been added into the system, it cannot be modified further. So it locks it into place. Now, an administrator can always change a read-only field, but users cannot. So in order for us to put this policy into place, we have to make the invoice date a read-only field. So we're going to select that and go save. And we've now passed that particular test. So there's a quality check that happens. And this is one of the things I was saying before in the setup period, where you want to double check that the metadata fields have been built in a way that makes sense. Let's go back into the edit here. You can see I only have one field that's a read-only, which is the invoice date. And I'm also going to take off required from there just because I want to make sure that's, actually, you know what, we'll leave required on for now. That should be fine. So good, we've saved that. We're good, and we're going to go back to our list. There's our list of documents, including our AP invoices. Perfect, so we've now applied our policy. We're going to go back over to the desktop application, and we're going to do a refresh because I've just changed my policy on the documents. I want to make sure this reads properly. So we're going to do a refresh. Think. I have a slower system, pardon me for that. There we go. We're going to click on our document, open up the metadata. And now if we scroll down, we should see a deletion date onto this. So we didn't have this before. And we can see that this document will delete on Saturday, April 21st, 2029. So 7 years after the policy was put into place, we can see this document was added on April 21, 2022. So 7 years after that, the document deletes itself. So we've now built a retention policy into this, and we've enforced it using that event metrics in order to make sure that this comes through. Now, the nice thing about this is, even though this is a single document, any of my invoices now that match that document type will have that same policy into place. So now I can scroll down, and I can see the delete date on this one is 2028 because I've built that into the document. The advantage of this means I don't have to worry about going back and removing these documents from the system. This is going to happen for me. Now, I want to have one other quick word here about deletion. Deletion is sort of a bit of a term of art that's used within a computer system. When we think about deleting a piece of paper, let's just think about the physical medium for a second. If we want to delete that piece of paper, there's not a lot of options that we have. Typically, people will do is they'll shred the document. And once it's shredded, it's usually considered destroyed. Now, obviously, there's software technology now that can actually reassemble shredded documents. That's not new, but it does mean that we have to have a different level of destruction depending on the kind of document that we're dealing with here. When we talk about deleting within FileHold, we're talking about a two-step process. So whenever we delete a document, that document will go into what we call a soft delete state. Now, just a word of explanation about this. We're used to sort of in a Windows world, when we click on a folder or an area, we're actually looking at the documents themselves. That's not true with FileHold. We're using a client, and the client is showing us the available document. So it's showing us the documents that I have a right to see in this folder. Of course, I'm a system admin, so I see everything, but the point stands, the idea is that I'm seeing the documents that I have access to. If I take one of my documents and I delete it, so we're going to right click on that and hit delete, or I could select my document, and if I have a right to delete it, the delete button will turn on. When I press delete, it's going to ask me if I want to delete only the specific version I've selected. So do you want to delete the current version or the one that I'd selected, or do I want to delete all of them? Let's delete all of them, and I'm going to say OK, and the document's no longer there. Now, if this was a Windows environment, I would go over to my recycling bin and see the document. Windows actually moves the document from one location to another. FileHold does not do that. We simply sever the connection between that document and the client. So it looks like the document's disappeared. It hasn't. It's still within the server, but I can't see it because it's in what we call a soft delete mode. Now, if you're an administrator, such as a system admin, I can go into the backend. So again, we're into the web client. We're into the backend settings. We're going to go to library management. And we're going to go to recover documents. This is effectively the recycling bin that we have But in this case, we're simply move those documents over to this area, and now we're going to get rid of these from this. We're going to now restore the document that we just moved over to there. So we're going to select our document, and now we're going to recover it. Now that recovering will basically remove it from that soft delete state and put it back into there. These documents will stay in this soft delete state for as long as my system allows it. And we control that here under Library Configuration, Settings, General. And you'll see at the top here that there is a permanent document deletion scheduling. I have it set to 1 day because it's a test environment. If I'm deleting it, I don't want it to hang around. Most organizations will do 30 days, 90 days. You can go up to as high as 999 days. So you've got a very long time if you want to. And that's how long that document will stay in that soft delete state until it permanently deletes. Once it's permanently deleted, you cannot use any file hold tools to recover that document. Now, in theory, a forensic software could come in and recover that. Of course, if it's an older document, there's a fairly good chance that piece of the disk space will be overwritten. That document will no longer be available. So we want to be clear when we talk about delete, we're not talking about a destruction state. We're not talking about making these documents completely unrecoverable in every way. What we are talking about is making it impractical to recover the document. And in most organizations, that meets the standard we're looking for document deletion, that nobody can go in and recover that document easily once it's done. Yes, you can use a specialized software and you can recover a shredded document. You can scan every shred of that, run it through the software, and it can reassemble it. That's not to say that shredding a document is not considered to be a non-secure way of disposing of a document. It is. But we're talking about retention policies here, and we want to make sure we're clear. We talk about deletion. It is theoretically possible to recover that document. It's just very impractical without a forensic software of some kind because you can't get it anymore. And just to finish the thought, we're going to go back over to our directory over here. And there's our document recovered. And if I was to go into this, I could right-click on this, view the version history, or click on the version number. And now from here, I could select my document, go to the usage of the file, and we'll see everything that happened there. So there's my scheduled for deletion, and there's the document recovered. So we consider both of those actions. So I deleted the document, but the sysadmin user that I was logged in as is the one who actually did the recovery for it. So you've got both of those stages. So when we talk about document retention policies, how long we're going to keep them for, the default in FileHold is to keep everything in perpetuity. It's your system, it's your hard drives. If you want to make them massively large and full of documents, we totally support that. We're not saying that you need to purge out your documents, but there are best practices that will help you get towards a cleaner, less packed environment where you simply have less documents hanging around that you no longer need operationally.